Most of the time when I'm sent a key for something, it's something that I've specifically requested or something that I've researched and just generally know about the existence of. But very occasionally I'll be sent sort of a surprise. I'll be sent something that I've never even heard of before. And that's exactly what happened with this game, Mayhem in Single Valley. That's kind of my favorite thing to have happen because, as anyone that's watched this channel for very long would know, I like to bring obscure and somewhat unknown games to people's eyes. So it's always a really nice feeling to actually be able to play something that I've never even heard of myself before. When you make YouTube videos, you tend to go into something with a lot of information, at least knowing what it is in general, having heard of it before, because you have to, of course, figure out what your next video is going to be. So getting a chance to go in basically completely blind to something with no expectations, no idea what I'm actually going to get, is a rare but fun treat. And Mayhem in Single Valley is basically a sort of puzzle action-adventure kind of game that seems to be calling back to a lot of the older, like very old retro puzzle adventure games, thinking of stuff like the Quest games from Sierra, like King's Quest and Space Quest. It almost seems like it's kind of going for that sort of idea, but in a more modern way that's a lot more direct and doesn't use click-to-move movement, instead it uses WASD. And the puzzle solutions are a little bit more Zelda-y, I guess you could say. They're a lot more physical and environmental puzzles rather than a lot of inventory puzzles, although there still are some of those. That is one thing that tends to scare people away when you're talking about retro puzzle adventure games like the Quest series and other games like that, is the fact that a lot of times those old school puzzle games had some very strange logic to the solutions of their puzzles. You know, you have to find a fish hook to fish out a pack of gum from a sewer that lets you chew the piece of gum, put it on the end of a stick so you can grab a nickel from a grate somewhere, use the nickel in the vending machine to get a key to move on to the next area. Like, a lot of the old school puzzle solutions were kind of like a very diseased logic. They were often deliberately weird and hard to figure out because the sort of obtuseness of them was part of the point, really. But this game goes for a much more direct, much more simple puzzle solving. Like I said, that goes very much for like environmental puzzles, you know, dragging and pushing things around, combining certain things in your inventory that make sense. You may be presented with a sort of hub-like area with a piece of machinery or a door or something that you have to operate, and then there will be several other areas alongside that you will need to go to get various bits to cause something to happen to actually allow you to move on, and it's all a lot easier to figure out, a lot more logical. For instance, early on you'll find this sort of piece of construction machinery that can cut down a tree, and something that you need is on top of a tree. So obviously, you know immediately you have to get this machinery working, so you have to go and find a saw blade for it and drag the saw blade to the machine from one of the other screens. You'll have to go and find the keys in one of the other areas to actually get access to the machine itself, and you'll have to go to a third area to find a gas can to actually gas up the machine and use it, and once you complete all those things, you can use the machine to cut down the tree. So you have a lot of puzzles like that, a lot of solutions that are very physical in nature and immediately make sense, allowing you to be pretty sure of what you need to be doing at any given time. And this always knowing roughly what you're meant to be working towards at the time is extremely important, not just to make the puzzles, more satisfying to solve and more interesting to actually work at, but also because the game does not use a map or any sort of objective markers or anything. The areas are quite open and large and just meant for you to explore around and figure things out at your own pace, basically. So you need that sense of knowing in general at least what you're meant to be working towards, because you're going to be finding various bits and bobs and puzzles of things around the place that you just have to sort of solve and make it all make sense, since you won't have an arrow that tells you where to go next or a large map with markers on it that tells you what you're supposed to be accomplishing. And that was actually the first part of the game that I was immediately really surprised and impressed by, was how open it is. The fact that the areas are just meant for you to explore. And this is the kind of game where you're going to come across the problem first most of the time, and then you'll be sort of examining the area, and then you'll instinctively know what the solution is that you're supposed to be looking for. So then at that point you'll be exploring the rest of the areas around that problem to actually find the solution itself. And I think that's actually a really smart way to design a puzzle game like this, because it makes the puzzle satisfying to solve. It gives you something that you're always working towards. You always have a goal in mind no matter where you are, and it also helps to give context to these areas that you can explore at your own pace and what they're actually for. You might find a building and not really know what you're supposed to do a little bit, so you'll just venture somewhere else for a while, but eventually you'll know after completing a puzzle on a different screen somewhere else that you can actually move stuff around and jump on them as movable platforms, or push a log that you maybe thought was actually part of the background decoration or something, and you'll find your way around these puzzles just by experimenting and exploring, which is a really nice organic way to actually have the player solve all these environmental puzzles. Just allow them to mess around with the environment for a while until they figure out what they need to do. So I was really impressed by that aspect. I actually expected at first, seeing how open it was, that I was going to constantly lose my way, especially since there was no map. I was afraid that I was going to run across areas that I just didn't know what to do or didn't know where to go, but very rarely have I ever felt going through this game that I didn't know what to do next. And even in those areas where I wasn't entirely sure, I tended to find a solution or a problem somewhere pretty quickly that let me know that, informed me what I needed to be doing at that time. So even though the game is quite open and very much like non-linear in terms of its exploration and its puzzle solving, you don't really feel lost. You never really feel like you're just confused and don't know what to do next. There's pretty much always a direction that the game is subtly pushing you in to solve things and move on. Now, the game does use a sort of multi-layer inventory system. You have a backpack as an actual openable inventory that you can mess around in. You can also combine items in your inventory to different effects. One of the best combinations you can get is when you get hooch, you can get some alcohol that actually allows you to cure the enemies of their sort of zombie-like status, and you can combine that alcohol with various other things because different enemies eat different kinds of food. So if you're going up against zombie rats, for instance, maybe you want to have some cheese. If you've got some cheese, you can use it in your slingshot to distract them from you because you don't have a way of directly defending yourself. You don't have a weapon per se. It's mostly about distracting enemies and moving around them than it is about killing them. You don't really kill things in this game. And but eventually, once you find some jars of hooch, you can actually combine that with the cheese and make some cheese soaked in it. That will actually not just distract the rats, but actually cure them, basically removing an enemy from the screen without you actually killing anything, which is a pretty creative way to actually make the combat, quote unquote, work. It's not really combat because you're not fighting things, but it does allow you to remove threats in a sort of indirect way, which is pretty interesting. You do have several other pieces of equipment that you'll find as well, like your shoes, which determine your movement speed and your dodge distance and stuff like that. Of course, you have your backpack, which determines how many things you can carry, as well as how large stacks can get. Upgraded backpacks not only just give you more inventory space, they also allow you to hold more of the same item in a single stack. And you've also got your slingshot. You'll get pretty early on in the game, and it allows you to fire things instead of just throwing them so that you can reach much farther distances with it. And this is very important, as I mentioned, for distracting the enemies, because every different enemy has a different food that it likes, and you can actually carry all sorts of different things in that inventory you see in the middle bottom of the screen that represents your ammunition, basically. And you can use these for distraction of enemies as well as hitting of switches and balloons and other sort of distant targets depending on what you're carrying. Rocks are a very useful tool that you can actually use to sort of push enemies away and stun them a little bit depending on the upgrade level of your slingshot. And food is what you use to actually distract them. And once you get these empty jars, you can find these stills all around the place that you can fill with alcohol, and you can dip your various food items in these jars of alcohol, and that becomes a curative item instead of a distractionary item that you can use on any given enemy to make them not a zombie anymore, basically. There is an upgrade system that uses duct tape. You can find clones of yourself in all sorts of compromising positions around the world. They might be stuck in walls or stuck in holes in the ground or just in very out-of-the-way places like hidden porta potties. You can find them all over the place, and once you rescue them, each one will give you one roll of duct tape, and you can use these rolls of duct tape, storing them up to upgrade your various pieces of equipment. And the upgrades are very important in this game because being able to stun enemies, for instance, by upgrading your slingshot is a big deal. Being able to hold more items can be very useful later on, and being able to upgrade your shoes is very important because you actually move extremely painfully slowly when you first start the game. Your character's movement speed is very, very slow, and you have a very basic dodge roll. But as you upgrade your shoes, you will get much faster movement speeds and a greater dodge roll that allows you to cover more distance, as well as once you max out the shoes, eventually you'll get an air dodge, which gives you a lot more mobility. So that was actually one of my first initial complaints about the game, was the fact that you move like painfully slowly, and it makes exploring this pretty large world a little bit obnoxious, but it turns out it's actually meant to be that way for you to have room to upgrade to make it better. Whether or not you like that idea is very much up to you, but once I upgraded the shoes about 3 times, I felt that the movement speed was a lot more reasonable, and coincidentally that's also around the time that you'll be facing a lot more enemies that you'll need to move around, so it works out that way. And then you'll be exploring the world of Single Valley itself, a very inhospitable place full of this green goop that turns everything into a sort of zombie-like version of itself that goes after you, including people. And you'll meet all sorts of other characters along the way. There will be lots of sort of incidental little side characters that have a theme of losing some sort of piece of clothing that you have to go and find for them, and once you bring it back to them, they'll either give you just thanks or maybe some sort of item to continue your quest with, and there will be lots of other non-zombie characters that you'll meet along the way that you'll have to perform fetch quests and the like for, and they will give you items in order to allow you to actually continue the game. So, you know, keys for doors, or they might actually just walk you to a new area themselves. And the game does have a pretty good variety between its environmental puzzles that you'll solve just by bringing things to other things and sort of rubbing them together until it works, and puzzles that involve actually going and getting a certain item or thing, bringing it to a character so that they can do something for you, and it may even involve some other sort of environmental puzzles at the same time. So for instance, there's a character that you have to not really escort but protect in a certain area by actually turning on these fans that will divert all of the enemies coming towards you and allow them to actually do whatever it is that they need to do with these computers in order to allow you to advance. So yeah, there's a pretty good variety of puzzles between the ones that you'll actually have to solve just on your own that you come across in the world, and the ones that you will have to help or have help from NPCs with to advance the story. And there are also some sort of boss fight like things. I mentioned there's not really combat in the game, so the boss fights are very much puzzles in and of themselves, involving the manipulation of environmental things like dragging stuff into certain locations and dodging their attacks while you're sort of setting them up to hurt themselves or to have something happen to them, and to have other NPCs help you out during the bosses. So the boss fights themselves are very much like puzzle encounters, effectively. And of course, there's also a pretty good amount of side questing content of just extra screens and other areas that you don't have to go to, but you can, to find more clones of yourself to get more upgrades, or to just find other NPCs that have sort of side questy bits for you to do just for completion's sake. And there's actually quite a lot to learn with all the individual enemies, because every different sort of zombified enemy has its own attack patterns and various things that it does, and you actually die in one hit in this game, so you have to learn their patterns and what their attacks are and how, like, what the dodge timings are for them and stuff. You have to learn this very well, because anything hitting you will just kill you straight up. You do get the ability to find trash cans and use trash can lids as shields, and they'll protect you from one attack each, and with upgrades you can hold multiple shields at once. But you can always, of course, rely on having any of these shields available to you, so when it comes to dealing with enemies, your best bet is to learn what foods they like so you can distract or cure them, and learn their attacks so that you can dodge through them and get through the areas, because you're not going to be killing things, and you're a very fragile character. Overall, I think Mayhem in Single Valley is actually a really good time. It harkens back in the right ways to a lot of old school puzzlers without being too much like them logically, and instead using a much more modern, almost Zelda-like logic to its puzzles. It's got a lot of different enemies to learn and deal with, and it's also got a lot of different locations, a lot of environments that you'll be exploring around, from old, abandoned, haunted schools, complete with ghost puzzles, to underground facilities, to forests, to zoos, and some other places beyond that. So there's quite a bit to like here, actually, and the game is fairly long. It's quite densely packed. There isn't a lot of downtime. Even in the fetch quests, you tend to be going to new areas to do them rather than backtracking through a bunch of places you've already been. And it takes about 7 or 8 hours or so to actually complete, roughly, depending on your playstyle. So that's pretty good, actually. I think that makes for a pretty solid experience, and it's definitely worth going for if you enjoy this more classic, retro-y, puzzly, action-adventure sorts of things. It's rarely frustrating because you tend to have a pretty good idea of what you're actually supposed to be doing, and most of the frustration in my experience comes from later on in the playthrough. You will be doing some pretty difficult encounters and some difficult puzzle areas, and because it uses a checkpoint system and you die so easily, you might find yourself repeating those areas multiple times if you die near the end. Checkpoints aren't always all that forgiving later on in the game, so that's something to bear in mind, but I do think it is a very solid experience still. So that is Mayhem in Single Valley. The link is in the description below this video if you want to check out the Steam store page for yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, something a little bit different for the channel, and I'll see you next time.